Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I do hope it finds you well. My name is John, and I am an author, and I'd like you to join me on another Writing Wednesday while I talk some about my, writing process and some aspects of writing. And today, what I'm going to be talking about is what I imagine is a lot of authors' least favorite thing to do, which is editing. Um, First off, big shout out to anyone who doesn't like editing. More respect, more power to you and all the professional editors out there. Um, Love it. Keep up the great work on helping your writer friends out. So editing for me starts with I tend not to. If it's not more than a few pages back, I tend not to do much editing when I'm doing my rough draft. I'm usually going back, you know, I start from the beginning, write my way through to the end, and then come back and do editing. I say not more than a few pages back because, sometimes if I notice an easy mistake to fix as I'm going back to reference something, like I've forgotten the name I called something, or I forgot a particular detail from an earlier chapter, scroll back up the document, find the information I'm looking for. And occasionally in the process of that, I realize, maybe a little tweak here, or, I notice an obvious like typo or weird sentence that I can fix in like 10 seconds. Or I realize something where, I go back to the previous setup or the previous foreshadowing and realize something that I could, now that I'm, at the actual event, something that I could do, to make the foreshadowing a little clearer, and I'll change it right then. But mostly when I'm writing, I just go from, chapter, prologue, if they have one, chapter one, two, three, get to the end, and then come back and do editing. Um, One of the really, really big things I recommend is uh, certainly make sure to, like, once you're done with your rough draft, is have some people whose thoughts and opinions you trust give you feedback on it and give you notes. Um, and those can be anything from people who are interested, maybe, have a writing mindset themselves, or just big fans of the genre you're working in my case, fantasy. I have several friends, I have a number of friends who are really into fantasy that's, would give good feedback. A friend of mine, my closest friend, Doug, um, he's also, does, writes in the fantasy genre. So we've always, traded our works in progress back and forth and given, editing and notes and feedback on them. One thing I also very, very much recommend is, you know, find someone who can, but also give the book to, or give your work in progress to at least one person who can really read the book and focus more on like things like clarity and grammar and stuff like that. The reason that's helpful is if you're giving it to other writers, maybe people that you've talked about your writing a lot before, you've talked about the story, or just very, very familiar and immersed with the fantasy genre, is there's a tendency, every genre has its own, and writing in general, but every genre has its own sort of tropes and shorthand and stuff like that, that, just be, we're familiar with things, familiar with the genre use, and that has a tendency of sometimes um, creating it where it's hard to recognize, if something doesn't make sense. You've got a friend you've talked about and talked about and talked about your work in progress. You've exchanged ideas, exchanged suggestions, um, And a lot of that comes to exchange ideas, exchange suggestions. And so they know where the story's going, they know what your ideas are, or they're just really familiar with your writing or the fantasy genre, so it's easy for them to not catch like passages or sequences that don't make much sense. And it's the same thing when you go back and write it. If you know what the end game is and know what you're building up to, sometimes when you're going back and editing, at least I find for myself, that it's very easy for the mind to just not really pay enough attention that a certain sequence or a certain buildup or a certain character or anything really doesn't make a lot of sense because you know what it's building to, um, rather than what it is in the moments. And someone who might not is not familiar with your work, is not familiar with where the story is going, or who isn't so used to the fantasy genre that they know the shorthand of oh the you know the character that goes into the cave to fight their inner demons or whatever. Was it commonly used trope in fantasy? I don't think I've ever used that one in particular, at least not that literally. But there's that there's a tendency, it's like, oh, it's this typical part of a fantasy book, and you just skip right over the fact that it doesn't, why he's doing that, why he or she or they are doing it doesn't make any sense, um, why they're saying that, doing that. So having someone who's can really focus on that can be really helpful. For that, one of the most useful, the one I've turned to both honestly for my books, but also when I was in school, in my both honors thesis in undergrad and my master's thesis. Um, my mom was very, very helpful with that. She's very attuned and attentive in catching grammatical mistakes, and also flagging has always been very helpful in flagging. I mean, my degrees are in history. She's interested in history, but isn't like like a focused scholar on it, like I was or was trying to be when I was getting my degree. And similarly, she likes and appreciates the fantasy genre, but is not like deeply immersed in it like I have been most of my life. So it's easy for her to catch those bits and not only really focus on the grammar and sentence structure and stuff like that, but flag passages like this doesn't make sense. Why is this character doing it? Why is this happening? Why are they doing this? Why did they say that? Like, I'm not really understanding the jump from scene A to scene B of like how those connect to each other, and can really help you know catch those things. So what I do is, after I send those off to my works off for people to read and give me feedback. Usually at that point, I will sort of leave that work and leave that rough draft alone for a little bit, let it sit, just to make sure that I can come back to it with fresh eyes. Because if you, at least in my personal experience, if I read or reread the same thing happens where I sort of become, I guess you could call it, nose blind to like errors and problems, because I've just been so deep and immersed in working on it. So I usually let it sit for a little bit. Um, in the past, that's meant no writing whatsoever, but I have some other projects on deck that when I finish the third book, my third book, When Gods Do Meddle, hopefully sometime in the next few months, I can get to and actually finish that, the rough draft of that. And I've got some other things, maybe, and actually some things in a couple of short story ideas, a couple things in other genres that I want to play with, as opposed to just not writing at all. But then, even if I haven't gotten feedback about, because we all have busy lives, so it's not always the easiest to just be like, hey, here's my 500-600 page Word documents. Can you read this and give me feedback on it? It's going to take them some time. But even then, once I've let it sit for a couple months or a month or two, I'll go back and, just start from the beginning, start editing, certainly trying to fix grammatical mistakes and clarity, sentence structures that I'm not happy with. Also, making things consistent. I have a tendency sometimes, especially if for one reason or another, in circumstances where there's been a gap in writing, where I've sort of changed my mind about the characterization. So it's oftentimes bringing those early chapters into line with the rest of the book. That was a particular struggle with my first book, The Shadow of the Past, because I wrote 3 chapters one year, 3 chapters the next year, the rest of the book the following year. And then, but during that 3 years, during that sort of 2 year window, sort of my conception of the story and where I wanted it to go changed drastically. So that one was particularly challenging, sort of melding them all together. And I do have something of a habit of changing names or forgetting what name I used. And so sometimes it's a matter of deciding, like, which name do I like better, fixing, correcting that. Um, since I primarily work in Word, sort of a couple pieces of advice I have for that. Since I write in the fantasy genre and a lot of that involves making up names and words, a big one I'm a big fan of is when I'm happy with the name for something, I will tell Word to add it to the dictionary so it stops correcting it as misspelled. That also that helps in 2 ways. Is first, um, catching those areas where I misspelled my own character's name or some magic or spell or city name or whatever. Fixing something, fixing this my own spelling mistakes on a word that I invented, writing. It catches that and also helps me catch where, I've accidentally, started using a different word or a different phrase or changed it up a little bit, and allows me to find sort of what I'm happy on there. The grammar and spelling sort of suggestions in Word, you need to be very careful with, is my recommendation, because like spelling, obviously, if you're in any kind of genre where you're making up words or ideas, add to dictionary. There's ways of getting around that spelling thing, and telling it to just shut up about that. But in terms of grammar, it has some good suggestions, um, but there are times where you can easily, like, you want to use it very carefully. Don't just take its suggestions at face value, because sometimes a lot of the suggestions, so running a grammar check, or if you're just reading and not running, initially not running a grammar check, but you're just reading from the top, little blue squiggle underlines if this doesn't make grammatical sense, look at its suggestions, but think about what you're trying to say, what you're trying to do, because there's a tendency for Word in its grammatical structure to sort of homogenize, if that's the right word, sort of the grammar of it. And in 2 areas, first off, characters' dialogue. You want your characters to sound like your characters. So if they have a particular speech pattern, they may talk in a way just like every people do in everyday life. We don't always speak in the most grammatically correct way, especially if we're just speaking off the cuff, not like prepared, like a prepared speech or something. Um, so there's that. You don't want it to sort of homogenize your dialogue and keep your characters, if they have an idea of what they sound like, unique. And the second thing is, even if it's not dialogue, think about, language is really wonderful. And someone, I use this phrase a lot, but someone a lot smarter than me has observed, I mean, one of the things, as complicated and convoluted grammatically as English is, it also is such a remarkably poetically flexible language. and you can really do a lot to create like effects of stuff. Like if you're really trying to impress with like a list or a connection of things, like Word is going to tell you and a standard grammar is going to tell you is like if you're giving a list of, attributes, it's going to be, the queen was strong, comma, smart, comma, you know, graceful, comma, skilled, comma, beautiful, comma. But if you're really trying to create, majesty for it, like think about putting like you're really trying to like create the impression of the queen was strong and smart and skilled and beautiful, and really using like putting those ands in there is really think about what you're trying to convey with your language. And there's just some really great stuff you can do with that. Other than that, other than grammar and clarity, a lot of what I go back on, in my editing, at least my first couple rounds of editing, is, am I explaining, clarity, certainly, am I explaining things properly? Trying to make, going through, I think I know I mentioned in a previous video, like making your characters sound more unique and distinct from each other. That's really help, that could be really helpful. I'm sort of breaking it up like that. Um, Adding details. As I've gotten through writing, I've gotten better at sort of describing the landscape and the weather and making it feel like a world. Like my first book, like, other than one or two scenes in my first book, language is meant, like weather is mentioned, like in my first draft or two, was hardly ever mentioned. So, sort of dealing more with like weather patterns and seasons of the world and sort of fleshing out the world a little more, as I'm focusing on the, my initial writing, I'm focusing on the plot, I'm focusing on the characters, and now sort of adding, and the big world building, but then adding, a little bit more detail, a little bit more, um, you know, character and depth and dimension to the world is a lot of what I added on. And then it's honestly a matter of just, you get your feedback, read through the feedback and take it considerably, if it's grammatical suggestions, oftentimes they can be helpful. But again, just like Word, you can take it or leave it, whether grammatical, spelling, whatever. Obviously, if it's a definite mistake, fix it. But like if it's a matter of style, choose what you want or not. And same thing with, um, you know, what they say is clear or unclear, they'd like to know more about. Consider their suggestions, but you're the ultimate writer, so you don't have to take them. Like you run into a place where, and I've done that before, where it's like I'd love to hear more about that character, and it's like, yeah, that character is interesting, but I don't really intend on doing anything else with them, or like they're just sort of a one scene character, so they're not really going to come back up. So, or alternately, the same thing is like, yeah, that is a very interesting character, I could do more with them, and end up adding them into, folding them into later chapters. Or I'd love to hear more about this character's backstory, and similarly, it's like, I don't know if I have time for a 10-page detour to describe it, or I don't think it's really all that important. Take it or leave it, take it with a grain of salt. Certainly listen to them if they saying something isn't clear, doesn't make sense. But you choose how to fix it. And I'll sometimes sort of run suggestions, or have people that are giving me feedback and editing notes. I'll usually sit down with them, sort of go through it, make sure I understand, pitch sort of them suggestions on what I'm thinking about to fix it, to sort of workshop it a little bit, and then it's you know take a couple more passes. Once I've edited it several times, that's where it can be helpful to. It's going to take, for a book, it's going to possibly take a couple hours, but run the spelling and grammar check. A lot of times, you're going to be going through it, going, Ignore, ignore, ignore. Yep, I need to fix that. Ignore, 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 because it's going to again be flying some of this. It's going to be highlighting some of the stylistic stuff. Oh, oh, yep, I did spell that wrong. Fix it. Um, and then you know, and then work on getting it formatted and published. One thing I can say with absolute certainty is, especially my first book, but to some degree my second one too. Editing is such a tedious process that once I've edited and edited and edited and edited, chances are I probably have developed a love hate relationship with the project. But once you hit that point and there's no other major things you're flagging, maybe leave it for another month or so just to let it cool off and get your head out of that space, write some other stuff, do something else creative, and then come back, give it one more pass through. And if you don't find anything you really really want to change, that's when you start looking at publishing it. Either, in my case, I've chosen to do self-publishing through Amazon. In your case, if you want to send it out for consideration for other kinds of publications, do that. But that's sort of my recommendations in my editing process. It's that it's a phenomenally necessary but also tedious and time consuming, in my personal opinion, thing to do. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that. As usual, I'm going to end with first off, my usual plugs. For my books, we have The Shadow of the Past and The Sunburned Red. Both of them are available on Amazon for purchase and also through the Kindle library. I would love for you to buy them, check them out. What are your thoughts on editing? Do you have any thoughts, best practices? Leave them in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Other than that, I would love for you to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. My socials are below. I'd love for you to follow me on there as well. And I do hope you all have a wonderful day and get an opportunity to do something creative. But in the meantime, I will catch you on the next one.